What if one war could change the course of world history? More than 250 years ago, 13 small British colonies on the eastern coast of North America challenged the most powerful empire on earth. Outnumbered, outgunned, and facing one of the world's strongest armies, these ordinary farmers, merchants, blacksmiths, and shopkeepers began a revolution that would create a new nation, the United States of America. But why did they risk everything? How did a group of colonies defeat Great Britain? And how did their victory inspire democratic movements across the world? This is the story of the American Revolutionary War. During the mid-1700s, Great Britain controlled 13 colonies stretching along North America's Atlantic coast. From Massachusetts in the north to Georgia in the south, nearly 2.5 million people lived under British rule. Most colonists considered themselves loyal British subjects. They traded with Britain, they spoke English, they followed British laws, and many believed their future was tied to the British Empire. The colonies prospered through farming, fishing, shipbuilding, and trade. Cities such as Boston, Philadelphia, New York, and Charleston became important commercial centers. Although life in America offered greater opportunity than many parts of Europe, the colonies remained under the authority of the British Crown. Everything would change after one costly war. In 1763, Britain emerged victorious from the French and Indian War. The victory greatly expanded British territory in North America. But success came at a price. The war had left Britain deeply in debt. British leaders believed the American colonies should help pay for the cost of defending the empire. Many officials argued that British soldiers protected the colonies, making new taxes both fair and necessary. To many colonists, however, these taxes represented something much more serious. They believed that government should not tax citizens unless those citizens had elected representatives who could vote on those taxes. Their argument became famous throughout history. No taxation without representation. It was more than a slogan. It became the foundation of a growing movement demanding greater political rights. In 1765, Parliament passed the Stamp Act. For the first time, colonists had to pay a direct tax on newspapers, legal documents, licenses, and many printed materials. The reaction was immediate. Across the colonies, protests erupted. Merchants organized boycotts. Crowds gathered in city streets. Many tax collectors resigned rather than enforce the law. Britain eventually repealed the Stamp Act. But the conflict had only begun. Over the following years, additional taxes fueled even greater anger. Each new law increased distrust between Britain and its American colonies. Political leaders, newspaper publishers, and ordinary citizens began openly questioning British authority. The relationship between the colonies and the Crown grew more fragile with every passing year. On the evening of March 5, 1770, tensions exploded in Boston. A crowd confronted British soldiers stationed in the city. The situation quickly spiraled out of control. Shots were fired. 5 colonists were killed. The incident became known as the Boston Massacre. Although historians continue to debate exactly how events unfolded, colonial leaders used the tragedy to rally public opinion against British rule. Engravings, newspaper articles, and speeches spread throughout the colonies. For many Americans, trust in Britain had been shattered. Yet neither side realized that an even greater confrontation was approaching. 3 years later, Parliament passed the Tea Act. Although the law actually lowered the price of tea, many colonists viewed it as another attempt to force Parliament's authority upon them. On the night of December 16, 1773, a group of colonists disguised themselves and boarded British ships in Boston Harbor. Working quickly, they threw hundreds of chests of tea into the icy water below. The protest became known as the Boston Tea Party. Britain responded with harsh punishment. Boston Harbor was closed. Local self-government was restricted. Additional British troops arrived to enforce order. Instead of weakening resistance, these measures united many colonists against the British government. The road to revolution had begun. By the spring of 1775, the relationship between Great Britain and its American colonies had reached a breaking point. British authorities had received intelligence that colonial militias were secretly storing weapons and ammunition in the town of Concord, Massachusetts. General Thomas Gage, the British military governor, decided to act. During the night of April 18, 1775, nearly 700 British soldiers quietly marched from Boston toward Concord. Their mission was simple: confiscate the weapons, arrest Patriot leaders if possible, restore British authority before open rebellion could begin. But the colonists were already watching. Patriot riders, including Paul Revere, William Dawes, and Samuel Prescott, raced through the countryside, warning local communities. "The British are coming." Church bells rang, signal fires burned through the night. Within hours, colonial militia members, known as Minutemen because they could assemble at a minute's notice, began gathering with their muskets. The stage was set for history. At sunrise, on April 19, 1775, British troops entered the village of Lexington. Waiting for them were around 70 colonial militiamen. Neither side wanted to fire first. A tense silence filled the morning air. Then, a single gunshot echoed across the village. To this day, historians still debate who fired that first shot. Within seconds, both sides exchanged gunfire. Several colonial militiamen were killed. The British continued toward Concord, but the fighting had only just begun. As British soldiers searched for military supplies, hundreds of armed colonists surrounded them. Gunfire erupted again at the North Bridge in Concord. This time, the British were forced to retreat. As they marched back toward Boston, thousands of colonial militia attacked from behind stone walls, forests, and farmhouses. The retreat turned into a running battle stretching nearly 20 miles. By nightfall, hundreds of British soldiers had been killed or wounded. The American Revolutionary War had officially begun. News of Lexington and Concord spread rapidly throughout the colonies. Within days, thousands of volunteer militiamen surrounded Boston. British forces suddenly found themselves trapped inside the city. Although the colonists lacked a professional army, they were determined to prevent the British from expanding beyond Boston. The conflict had transformed from political protest into open war. Both sides understood there would be no easy solution. In June 1775, colonial forces fortified high ground overlooking Boston. British commanders knew those positions had to be captured. On June 17, 1775, thousands of British soldiers crossed Boston Harbor and advanced uphill toward colonial defenses. Wave after wave of disciplined British infantry marched directly into heavy colonial gunfire. The defenders waited until the enemy came within close range. Then they unleashed devastating volleys. Twice the British assault failed. Only after the colonial forces ran dangerously low on ammunition did British troops finally capture the hill. Technically, Britain had won the battle, but the cost was enormous. More than 1,000 British soldiers had been killed or wounded. The battle proved something that shocked military leaders across Europe. The colonial militia could stand and fight against Britain's professional army. The revolution was no longer a small rebellion. While fighting continued around Boston, representatives from the 13 colonies gathered in Philadelphia. The Second Continental Congress faced an enormous decision. If the colonies hoped to defeat Britain, they needed more than local militias. They needed a unified national army. On June 15, 1775, Congress unanimously selected George Washington to serve as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. Washington was an experienced military officer from Virginia, who had previously served during the French and Indian War. He accepted the responsibility with humility. He understood the challenge before him. His army lacked training. Supplies were limited. Many soldiers had little military experience. Yet Washington believed that discipline, determination, and perseverance could overcome Britain's superior numbers and equipment. His leadership would become one of the defining forces of the American Revolution. As 1775 came to an end, there was still hope among some that peace might be restored. But with blood already spilled at Lexington, Concord, and Bunker Hill, compromise was becoming increasingly unlikely. The colonies stood at a crossroads. Soon, they would make a decision that would change history forever. They would declare independence from Great Britain. By the summer of 1776, the conflict had grown far beyond a dispute over taxes. Months of fighting had convinced many colonial leaders that reconciliation with Great Britain was no longer possible. If the colonies were to survive, they would have to become an independent nation. Inside Philadelphia, delegates gathered for one of the most important meetings in American history. A committee led by Thomas Jefferson, with the support of John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, and Robert R. Livingston, prepared a document that would forever change the world. On July 4, 1776, the Continental Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence. The document announced that the 13 colonies were now free and independent states. It declared that all people are created equal and possess certain unalienable rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These ideas would inspire democratic movements for generations. But signing a declaration was one thing. Winning a war against the world's strongest empire was another. Following the Declaration of Independence, Britain responded with overwhelming force. Thousands of experienced British soldiers landed in New York, supported by one of the most powerful navies in the world. General George Washington and the Continental Army struggled to stop them. The Americans suffered major defeats. New York City fell to British control. Washington's army was forced into a long retreat across New Jersey. Many soldiers had no boots. Food was scarce. Disease spread through the camps. Enlistments were about to expire. Some believed the revolution was already lost. Yet Washington refused to surrender. On the icy night of December 25, 1776, he launched one of the boldest operations in military history. Leading approximately 2,400 soldiers, Washington crossed the frozen Delaware River during a fierce winter storm. The following morning, his army surprised Hessian troops stationed in Trenton. The victory was small in military terms, but enormous for morale. It revived hope throughout the colonies and proved that the Continental Army could still win. The war continued through 1777. British commanders believed they could divide New England from the rest of the colonies by capturing the Hudson River Valley. General John Burgoyne led thousands of British troops south towards Saratoga, New York. American forces surrounded his army. After weeks of fierce fighting, Burgoyne surrendered on October 17, 1777. The Battle of Saratoga became one of the most important victories of the Revolutionary War. It convinced France that the American cause had a real chance of success. For years, France had watched Britain struggle with growing interest. Britain was France's longtime rival. After Saratoga, King Louis XVI agreed to openly support the American Revolution. French money, weapons, soldiers, and warships poured across the Atlantic. One of the most important French officers was the young Marquis de Lafayette, who became one of George Washington's closest allies. Even more important was the arrival of the powerful French Navy. For the first time, Britain faced a global conflict rather than a colonial rebellion. The balance of power had begun to shift. As fighting continued, the Revolutionary War spread far beyond North America. Naval battles took place across the Atlantic Ocean and the Caribbean. European powers became involved. Spain and the Dutch Republic also entered the conflict against Britain. What had begun as a colonial uprising had evolved into an international war. Despite years of hardship, Washington's army remained in the field. The determination of the Continental Army and the growing support of its allies kept the dream of independence alive. The final chapter of the Revolution was now approaching. One decisive battle would determine the future of a nation. By 1781, the American Revolution had entered its 6th year. The fighting had exhausted both sides. Britain still possessed one of the world's strongest armies and the most powerful navy. Yet after years of war, its resources were stretched across multiple continents. Meanwhile, General George Washington saw an opportunity that could end the war. British General Charles Cornwallis had established a fortified position at Yorktown, Virginia, believing he could be supplied and protected by the Royal Navy. Washington realized that if British forces could be trapped there, the revolution might finally be won. But success depended on one crucial factor: the arrival of the French fleet. In August 1781, Washington secretly marched thousands of American soldiers south from New York. French forces under Comte de Rochambeau joined the campaign. At sea, the French Navy under Admiral François-Joseph Paul de Grasse defeated the British fleet at the Battle of the Chesapeake, preventing reinforcements from reaching Yorktown. Cornwallis was now trapped. By late September, nearly 17,000 American and French troops surrounded the British defenses. For weeks, powerful artillery bombarded British positions day and night. The constant shelling weakened Cornwallis's army and destroyed much of Yorktown's defenses. With no hope of escape and no reinforcements arriving, the British position became impossible to defend. On October 19, 1781, General Charles Cornwallis surrendered his army. More than 7,000 British soldiers laid down their weapons. The victory at Yorktown effectively ended major fighting in the American Revolutionary War. Although smaller military operations continued, Britain understood that defeating the colonies had become unrealistic. Across America, church bells rang. Celebrations filled the streets. After years of sacrifice, the dream of independence was finally within reach. Negotiations between Britain and the United States continued for nearly 2 years. On September 3, 1783, representatives of both nations signed the Treaty of Paris. Great Britain officially recognized the independence of the United States. The new nation gained territory stretching from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River. For the first time, the United States stood before the world as a free and sovereign country. The revolution was over, but the work of building a nation had only begun. Victory created opportunities, but also enormous challenges. The former colonies now had to establish a stable government, rebuild their economy, and unite 13 independent states. In the years that followed, leaders gathered once again in Philadelphia. Their work produced the United States Constitution, creating a new system of government based on the separation of powers, representative democracy, and the rule of law. Soon afterward, George Washington became the first president of the United States. The ideals expressed during the Revolution, liberty, representation, and self-government, became central to the identity of the new nation. The American Revolutionary War lasted 8 long years. Thousands of soldiers and civilians lost their lives. Entire towns were damaged. Families were divided. Yet from that struggle emerged a new nation founded on revolutionary ideas about freedom and government. The revolution inspired independence movements in Europe, Latin America, and beyond. Its influence can still be seen in democratic governments around the world today. More than 2 centuries later, the American Revolutionary War remains one of the most significant events in modern history. It reminds us that history is shaped by ordinary people, willing to stand for extraordinary ideals. The story of America's independence is not only a story of battles and victories, it is a story of courage, sacrifice, determination, and the enduring belief that people have the right to shape their own future. If you enjoyed this documentary, please like, subscribe, and share this video with others who love history.